Have you ever stopped to think about how a small island, often forgotten on the map of Europe, managed to dominate about a quarter of the entire planet? Well, at its peak, the British Empire ruled millions of people, controlled oceans, and influenced cultures on every continent. But here's the most intriguing part. It didn't start with power. It started with necessity, and that's exactly what you're about to understand. In this video, you'll discover how England went from a relatively isolated territory to becoming the greatest empire in history. And more importantly, what strategic decisions completely changed the fate of the world. But hold on, because this story has twists and turns that few people know about. It all begins at the end of the Middle Ages, when England was still far from being a superpower. In fact, it faced internal conflicts, power struggles, and even civil wars, like the famous War of the Roses. Nothing indicated that a global empire would emerge from there. But then, something changes. With the strengthening of the monarchy, especially during the reign of Elizabeth I, England begins to look outward. And here's a crucial detail. While other European powers, such as Spain and Portugal, were already exploring and colonizing territories, England lagged behind. But this lag ended up becoming an unexpected advantage. Why? Because the English were able to learn from the mistakes of others. Instead of just conquering land, they began to invest in something much more powerful: control of the seas. And this changes absolutely everything. A new generation of navigators, merchants, and pirates authorized by the crown emerged. Yes, pirates. Figures like Francis Drake were not just adventurers, they were key pieces of a larger strategy. They attacked Spanish ships, weakened rivals, and at the same time brought riches to England. It was a risky game, but extremely effective. And then one of the most decisive moments in this story occurs. In 1588, the powerful Spanish Armada attempted to invade England. At the time, it was the largest naval force in the world. Everything indicated that the English would be defeated. But what happens next changes the course of history forever. England wins. And not only does it win, it proves to the world that it can compete with and defeat the greatest powers of the time. This moment marks the beginning of something much bigger. But here's the point that few people realize. This victory was not the end of a threat. It was the beginning of an ambition, because from then on, England didn't just want to defend itself, it wanted to dominate. And in the next section, you'll understand how this ambition gave rise to the first colonies, and how the British Empire actually began to spread across the world in a way that no one could stop. Now think about it. After defeating the greatest naval power of the time, what would you do? Protect yourself or attack? England chose the second option. And this is where the game really begins. With clearer sea routes, the English began something that, at first glance, seemed simple: the creation of colonies. But it wasn't just about occupying land. It was about building a global network of power. The first attempts were not easy. The Roanoke colony, for example, simply disappeared without a trace, a mystery that still intrigues historians today. But even with failures, England persisted. And then came Jamestown in 1607, considered the first permanent English colony in North America. And here's a crucial point. These colonies were not just settlements. They were investments. Private companies, such as the East India Company, began to finance expeditions and administer entire territories. This means that the empire didn't just grow with soldiers. It grew with merchants, investors, and extremely well-calculated economic strategies. But there's a detail that changes everything. While other empires focused only on extracting wealth, the British began to create more complex systems of control, laws, administration, structured trade. It was almost like replicating England itself in other parts of the world, and it worked. Quickly, the empire began to expand across North America, the Caribbean, Africa, and especially Asia. And it is at this moment that India enters the British radar. But here the story takes on a new level of intensity. India was no ordinary territory. It was rich, populous, and extremely contested. Initially, the British arrived as traders, but little by little, they became involved in local conflicts, political alliances, and wars. And when they realized it, they were already ruling. But hold on to this. The growth of the empire wasn't just about external conquests. It also brought unexpected internal consequences. Now, the inevitable question is, how far could this empire reach? The answer is simple: to the top of the world. During the 19th century, the British Empire reached its peak. And we're not talking about something small. We're talking about a domain so vast that the famous phrase arose, "The sun never sets on the British Empire." This is because there was always some territory under British rule in broad daylight. But how was this possible? Here comes a decisive factor: the Industrial Revolution. While many countries were still stuck with agrarian economies, England transformed itself into the world's factory. Machines, railways, steamships, all of this allowed for mass production never before seen. And more importantly, it allowed it to sustain and expand the empire at an impressive speed. But there's a detail that changes everything. To maintain this growth, the empire needed three things: raw materials, consumer markets, and logistical control. And where to get these? In the colonies. In other words, the empire wasn't just political. It was economic. India, for example, became the jewel in the crown. Valuable resources came from there, while the local population consumed British products. It was a highly profitable system, but also profoundly unequal. And here, a silent problem begins to emerge. The larger the empire, the harder it was to control. Revolts began to arise. In India, the Sepoy Rebellion of 1857 shows that British rule was not as stable as it seemed. In other regions, cultural tensions, economic exploitation, and political impositions generated growing resistance. But even so, the empire continued to grow. Africa, for example, enters the center of the dispute during the so-called Scramble for Africa. In a few years, Europeans divided practically the entire continent, and the British secured a huge slice of this territory. But here is the critical point that many people ignore. This accelerated growth was creating internal rifts, maintaining armies, administering distant territories, dealing with revolts. All of this was costly, and not just financially, it cost stability. And then we arrive at a moment that changes everything again. The beginning of the 20th century. The world begins to enter a new era of global conflict. And the British Empire, which seemed invincible, finds itself embroiled in wars of unprecedented scale. But here's the most important detail. These wars not only tested the empire's power, they began to wear it down from the inside out. And now the question remains, how did something so large, so powerful, and seemingly unshakable begin to decline? Because in the next section, you'll see how the British Empire begins to lose control, face mass independence movements, and how this completely redefines the map of the world as we know it today. Now comes the most impressive part of this story. How did an empire that dominated the entire world begin to crumble? The answer lies not in a single event, but in a sequence of blows that came almost without giving time to react. The first major impact, World War I. The British Empire emerged victorious. Yes, but completely worn down. Millions of lives lost, a shattered economy, and a growing dependence on allies like the United States. It was a victory with a bitter taste, but the worst was yet to come. World War II. This was the true breaking point. Despite once again being on the winning side, the cost was devastating. The United Kingdom emerged economically weakened, with enormous debts and without the same capacity to sustain a global empire. And meanwhile, Something was silently changing in the colonies. Independence movements began to gain strength. India, for example, led by figures like Gandhi, showed the world that it was possible to resist, not only with weapons, but with strategy and popular mobilization. In 1947, Indian independence marked one of the biggest blows to the empire, and it didn't stop there. Over the following decades, several colonies in Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean began to gain their autonomy. What was once a centralized system of power transformed into a network of independent nations. But here's the most interesting point. The empire didn't disappear overnight, it transformed. Then the Commonwealth emerged, a kind of community of countries that maintain historical ties with the United Kingdom. It's no longer an empire in the traditional sense, but it still carries political, cultural, and economic influence. And this leads us to the great climax of this story. The true legacy of the British Empire lies not only in the territories it dominated, but in the world it helped shape. The English language became global. Political, legal, and economic systems spread across various countries. Borders were created, some still generating conflicts today. In other words, even after the end, the empire never completely ceased to exist. And perhaps that's the biggest twist of all, because the greatest empire in history didn't end with an explosion. It dissolved slowly, leaving deep marks that still influence the world today. Now tell me, have you ever stopped to think that so many things in your daily life might be directly linked to this empire? If this video made you see history differently, subscribe to the channel, because here we don't just tell stories. We reveal what's behind them.